It was a cold night after a heavy snowfall, and I was home alone. I decided to curl up in front of the TV with my cat to relax since I'd had such a long week. I lived in an apartment complex, so the occasional bit of noise from my neighbors was not unusual. But that night, I heard the strangest sound coming from what seemed like the wall facing out to the street. The source of the sound bothered me, since it was just empty air beyond the wall, and we didn't have many issues with pests like squirrels or raccoons. But it stopped as quickly as it started, so I figured the low moaning was probably just some strong wind or some distant street noise. At worst, I would have to talk to the landlord about some unfortunate infestation. About half an hour later, I heard it again, louder than before, and closer. A deep moan, like someone injured, or maybe an old man waking up from a deep sleep. It seemed to be coming from the wall behind my TV. I turned the volume down to see if I could hear it any better. Even my cat was tensed up and staring at the wall by this point. But again, the sound stopped. I became concerned, hoping one of my neighbors wasn't hurt somewhere without help. I decided to check out the hallway to see if the sound was coming from inside the building, but the halls were completely silent. I even went over to the stairwell to see if someone was there, but again, it was empty and quiet. I went back to my apartment to make sure my cat wasn't too freaked out. She was still on the couch, but her tail was flicking back and forth, ears flat on her head and arching her back, eyes still fixated on the wall. Within seconds, I realized why. Behind the TV, emerging from the wall, was darkness. It had only a vague shape, much larger than normal human size, and it was much darker than a normal shadow. I couldn't see anything behind it, but the light from the hallway didn't seem to shine on it. It's hard to describe how dark and dense but not solid it was. I froze like my cat, and the door swung shut behind me. The sound seemed to make the being slow down, but it continued moving out from the wall and around my TV. I tried to make out what kind of shape it was, and I couldn't. It was like it was just a dense shadow. I couldn't even tell if it sensed that I was there or not, so I decided to test it. I clapped my hands, which seemed silly at the time, but in my panic I couldn't figure out what else to do. The sound stopped it. I ran the few steps over to my couch and grabbed my poor, terrified cat, who dug her claws into me and climbed over onto my back, trembling. Shadow seemed to get even denser somehow, but still didn't form any shape I could recognize. In that moment I realized it did sense me and was now watching me, analyzing me. We stood there looking at each other for what seemed like hours, my heart racing and body completely tensed. Finally, it moved again. Almost instantly, it was inches from my face, and then just as fast, it moved through me. It was freezing cold, like it was made of the winter air outside. I thought I couldn't be any more scared, but as it passed through me, I felt a terror I have never felt before. It felt like a compilation of every time in my life I had been scared before suddenly flooding me all at once. I couldn't feel or see anything. I was just floating in that freezing blackness. It was like I had ceased to exist. It only lasted a fraction of a second, and then it was gone. I stood once more in my empty apartment. The TV was still playing on low volume, and my cat and I were still clinging to each other, shaking and whimpering. My muscles slowly untensed, and I had to hold the back of the couch to lower myself to the floor. I didn't sleep at all that night, not until the sun started rising, and I began to hear the sounds of life as my neighbors got ready for work. But I never saw any sign that the shadow had been there at all. My grandparents' house has always been creepy, but the last time I stayed there I found out just how creepy it could get. It was a nice little house off a side street in a small town where they had lived for their entire marriage, all 60 years of it. We lived about 40 minutes away in the city, so we spent a lot of time there. I first noticed something was off when I was about 10. I'd hear noises when no one else was inside, voices when everyone else was asleep. I even checked to make sure they were. I could never make out what the voices were saying, couldn't even tell if it was multiple voices or just one, or even if it was words at all, for that matter. It always seemed like it was the office that the voices were coming from. I wasn't allowed in there when I was young, though. The noises never really bothered me too much, so I just chalked it up to the neighbors or the wind, something explainable. But this past summer, I stayed with them for 2 months, helping them do some major cleaning. The place really needed it, and they were starting to slow down after being retired for so long. So I offered to come and help out. I still heard those voices from time to time, but no worse than they had ever been. Everything was normal until I started cleaning out the office. It looked like a time capsule. It was clean, not much dust on anything, but outdated decor and boxes of files and random household items everywhere. Those, combined with books, albums, and small pieces of furniture, made it very hard to move around. I decided to start with the files since they were already packed up. As soon as I started moving the first boxes of old files out, the voices started. It was broad daylight, and the voices had only ever happened at night, so already I was creeped out. They seemed clearer too, which confirmed what I thought before, that this room was the source of what I had heard over the years. I tried to listen to see if I could hear what they were saying, but I still couldn't make anything out. I did, however, realize that the tone of the voices was different. Before, they had only ever sounded like a normal conversation. But that day, they sounded almost offended, as though they were talking to someone who had done something they didn't like, seeing as I had just done something. In the room where I thought the voices were coming from, I decided to proceed with caution. I slowly picked up another box, and just as I did, I heard a very clear "No!" coming from the far corner. I was so startled, I dropped the box. I was frozen in place, just listening and watching for anything else. Nothing happened. I reached for the box again. I heard an annoyed hum from the same spot. I tried one more time to reach for the box, and this time I felt an actual slap on my hand. I was over it at that point and left the room. I went downstairs to the kitchen where I ran into my grandmother. I must have looked frightened because she asked me what was wrong. All I managed to say was I was in the office. Before she cut in with, "Oh, you must have met Madeline." To say I was stunned was an understatement. She explained that since they moved in, the office seemed to harbor a presence who they called Madeline, who was very protective of her space. If you didn't want to be bothered, you had to tell her what you were doing as you were doing it. Otherwise, she would mutter to herself all night about it. My grandparents had apparently had enough sleepless nights that they did their best to keep her informed. Even larger disturbances in the rest of the house were enough to set her off, she said, which explained the voices I had heard growing up. After a good laugh, I went back up to the office, ready to explain myself and hopefully continue with my work. Madeline mostly left me alone after that. I work as a security guard at an old age home. A few years ago, we lost one of our residents after he wandered off. It didn't happen often. We did have the odd dementia patient take off, as they do, but it never happened to ones like William. And after he passed, vanished, rather, well, we had something else happen that never happened before. William always hated the building and often told me how it was built wrong and should have just been torn down. He worked in construction back in his day, and I did a bit of carpentry myself, so I trusted what he said. He had wandered off, which wasn't that unusual for dementia patients, but William was sharp as a tack up to the end. And most residents we found pretty quickly, but we never saw hide nor hair of him. The scent dogs couldn't even get his scent. The whole thing was very odd, and it didn't stop when we lost him. The building started having abnormal maintenance issues. Truly strange things, not like the minor disturbances that the care workers often chalked up to ghosts. This was more like sabotage. Paint started coming off the walls in long strips, as if someone was peeling it off on purpose. Doors had scratches on them, little ones at first. But then long gouges that ran the whole height of the door, so bad we had to replace them. And then came the noises. The residents complained of them first, which we usually didn't take very seriously since they complained about a lot of things. But then we started hearing them. It was like the squeak of an old wheelchair as it was pushed around. And it would pick people to follow for a day or so, which drove us all nuts. We couldn't find any evidence of anyone or anything actually doing any of these things, so we just made the necessary repairs and moved on. Things were normal for a little bit, but one night when I was on the graveyard shift, I saw something on my security camera that I will never forget. The door to William's old room opened all by itself. I saw no movement, so I went to check it out, figuring it was maybe the wind or just the building settling and shifting the door frame, dislodging the closing mechanism. In any case, I wasn't yet scared, I get there, and nothing seemed amiss, so I closed the door and went back to my station. Sure enough, the door swings open again. But this time, William rolled out in his creaky old wheelchair. But he was different. He seemed not quite solid. I could see through him. He looked right at the camera and smirked. My stomach dropped, and my whole body went cold. The screen cut out and turned black. In the quiet that followed, I could hear the squeak, squeak, squeak of a wheelchair rolling in my direction. I was shaking all over, but I stood up and shone my flashlight in the direction the noise was coming from. The noise stopped. I went around my desk to look down the hallway to see if someone was there, but everywhere I looked was empty. I decided to wait at my desk with my cameras to catch any movement there might be. A few minutes passed and nothing. I started to relax a bit, trying to piece together what might have just happened, when I started to smell smoke. No alarms were going off, which was strange, but the camera that had cut out earlier snapped back on. Smoke was flowing out the top of the doorway to William's old room. I ran down there to deal with it and evacuate the remaining residents on either side. No one was hurt, and only William's room was damaged, but the owners decided enough was enough, and they ended up selling the place. I went by about 2 years after, and the place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Everything was crumbling, and there were even some exposed places where the roof had completely rotted away. As I walked around the old grounds, I once again heard that squeak I thought I'd never hear again. But this time, I also heard what could only be William's wheezy old chuckle. I guess he was having fun demolishing the building he hated so much. So which of the 3 stories did you like the most? Make sure to tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing horror stories.